Hello. I'd like to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour talking about uh, and laying out how changes in how disability is understood and a concomitant shift to a strengths-based approach to educating learners with disabilities align with structural changes to education overall to impact transition in the 21st century. And I want to start broad, and one starting point for thinking about a 21st century education for all learners with disabilities are the general principles in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD. These principles articulate the gold standard, as it were, for how society should treat people with disabilities. The first such standard is that of, quote, respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices, and the independence of persons. The education article in the CRPD, Article 24, states that parties who adopt the CRPD, quote, shall ensure an inclusive education system directed to the full development of human potential and sense of dignity and self-worth, and the strengthening of respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human diversity, enabling persons with disabilities to participate effectively in a free society. It is clear then that issues of educating students with disabilities are linked to themes of dignity, autonomy, self-worth, choice, potential, and participation. Yet if we examine how people with disability have been treated historically, these themes rarely appear. I believe this is mainly a result of how we have understood disability over time. Historically, disability was understood within a model that was an extension of a medical model, which conceived health problems, including disability, as an individual pathology. Disability was understood to be a characteristic of the person, as somehow residing within the person, and that person was seen as broken or diseased or atypical, as somehow outside the norm. Unsurprisingly, such attributions led to segregation and maltreatment. By the end of the 20th century, however, it had become apparent that such conceptualizations were no longer useful, as people with disabilities became more and more a part of society as they held jobs, succeeded in education, and became contributing members of society. Understanding people with disability as broken or diseased no longer made sense. Thus, over the past several decades, these earlier understandings of disability have begun to be replaced by ways of thinking about disability that focus on the interaction between personal capacity and the context in which people live, learn, work, and play. Two World Health Organization taxonomies of disability, the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps, or the ICIDH, introduced in 1980, and the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, or the ICF, introduced in 2001, provided us with the language to begin talking about strengths-based and positive approaches to disability. The ICF was particularly important, conceptualizing disability as a function of the interaction among health, environmental, and personal factors, and their impact on activities and participation. Let me summarize what I think the WHO classifications established in a very simplistic manner. The focus of these new strengths-based models of disability shifted from an historic emphasis on disability as deficits residing within the person to a focus on the fit between a person's capacities, their abilities, their strengths, and the demands of the context in which that person might want to live, learn, work, or play. Within this, disability resides only in the gap between what a person can do and what the person wants to do. And the degree to which we can reduce the gap, although the impairment does not go away, disability at some level becomes irrelevant. So what these ways of thinking about disability do for us in transition education is to shift us first and foremost to a strengths-based approach to education and transition that emphasizes a person's abilities. Let me provide an example of where strengths-based approaches can take us. My colleagues and I have worked with the VIA classification of strengths as a mean to focus on strengths for young people with disabilities. We've created a supplemental guide to the implementation of the VIA inventory of strengths for youth in terms of using that online free assessment of character strengths with young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The VIA looks at multiple categories and domains of character strengths, and it leads us to, gives us an opportunity to assess issues that we know these young people possess, but we often don't talk about. So you ask yourself how education might be different if young people who are supported are assessed to determine their kindness or their optimism or their fairness, their forgiveness, their creativity, or if they had IEP goals written upon their appreciation of beauty and excellence, their social intelligence, or their curiosity. These strengths-based approaches shift how we think about young people, and it shifts us to think about what they do well, what they're good at, what character strengths, what abilities they have. Second, these person-environment fit models, as we talk about them, emphasize disability as a part of and not apart from typical human functioning. Third, by defining disability as a function of the interaction between the environment and the person's capacities, the focus of the problem shifts from fixing the person to reducing the gap between what a person can do and what that person wants to do, and on enhancing and promoting participation. We shift from creating programs that are designed based upon type or level of impairment to identifying personalized supports. And these models demand fundamentally that we focus on enhancing autonomy and self-determination. In considering the importance of participation in these new models, we need to think about what we mean by participation. The ICF defines disability by the impact on a person's activities and participation. So it is at the level of activities and participation that we see, quote, disability. Fundamentally, in our own work, we've defined participation as a person's active, intentional, volitional, and goal-directed engagement in the roles, life situations, and activities that comprise daily life. These strengths-based models focus on the importance of supports to improve the fit between a person's capabilities and the demands of the context. Supports are quite simply resources and strategies that are personalized and enable people to access other resources, information, relationships, all within integrated inclusive environments, and that result in increased integration and enhanced personal growth and development. Supports are anything, I would argue, that enable people to live self-determined lives. Further, supports refer to an array, not a continuum of services, to individuals and settings that match the person's needs, where the person is at the center and the types of supports radiate out from self-directed and self-mediated supports to supports from the person's family and friends, and non-paid supports like coworkers and neighbors, to generic supports, and finally to more specialized supports like those provided in a disability support system. But they begin with the person and enabling the person to become, in a sense, their own natural support. So the good news, I think, is that we don't have to start from scratch with the design of interventions that are driven by these environment fit models. There are, in fact, multiple examples from practices in the education of learners with disability that illustrate the application of these new paradigms to educational practice. These include the implementation of universal design for learning, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and the use of technology to promote greater access to curricular materials, school-wide applications like positive behavior interventions and supports, and multi-tiered systems of supports, the application of personalizable education and personalized learning, a focus on self-determination and self-determined learning, and active student involvement and engagement in educational planning. All of these take approaches consistent with person-environment fit models of disability by focusing as much on changing the environment and the context and providing supports as on changing the person. Take, for example, positive behavior interventions and supports. One of the founders of PBIS, Ted Carr, defines it as a set of practices that remediate deficient contexts. It is about changing the context so that problem behavior becomes irrelevant and unnecessary. Or let's look at how principles of universal design for learning operationalizes person-environment fit models. These principles emerged, as many people know, from the field of architecture and suggested that all buildings should be designed to be accessible to all people without the need for modification or adaptation by incorporating ramps, wide doors, or accessible restrooms. Education policymakers adapted and adopted this approach to supporting students to gain access to the general education curriculum. The universal in universal design does not imply one optimal solution for everyone, but rather it underscores the need for inherent, flexible, customizable content, assignments, and activities. My personal favorite definition of UDL was published by National CEC staff several years ago, and it defines it as, quote, the design of instructional materials and activities that allows the learning goals to be achievable by individuals with wide differences in their abilities to see, hear, speak, move, read, write, understand English, attend, organize, engage, and remember. Now, I don't know too many students with or without disability who aren't described to some degree by this list. And back to my main point, UDL is all about changing the context or the environment. In this case, that is the curriculum itself, so that it is usable by every student without modification, without changes. We tend to equate UDL with technology, and although there are ways to ensure universal access to educational content that does not use technology, it is certainly a fact that there are a myriad of barriers to full participation that will be removed by technology in education and other life domains. Digital talking books, smartphones, tablets, all provide platforms for universally designed learning materials to be presented. The growth of cloud-based technologies will soon make the specific device you use irrelevant, as all personalization features will reside in the cloud and you will be able to access them anywhere with any type of device. 3D printing will, I think, over the next decades, change the face of manufacturing. NASA is experimenting with 3D printing to print complex rocket parts. Futurists predict that in 50 to 75 years, we will have bioprinted organs. Instead of buying mass-produced products that do not fit their unique needs, 3D printing will allow people with disabilities to manufacture exactly what they need to be supported to do what they want. A company in London is selling 3D printed wheelchairs that can be custom fit and ready in 2 weeks at substantially lower costs. Finally, you may have heard of the term the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything. This is the idea that someday, and that day will be sooner rather than later, everyday objects, people, processes, and data will be networked and connected such that what you cannot do, I think, will become to a large measure irrelevant. What will matter will be the supports available for you to be successful. Right now, about 7 billion objects are connected to the internet. By 2025, that figure is estimated to be almost 25 billion objects. If you can't drive, it won't matter. Cars will drive themselves. Google Glass and Apple Watch are only the tip of the iceberg for wearable computing. There will be such fundamental revolutions in supports that most people will be able to be supported to engage in activities and more fully participate in the totality of their lives, including in learning and education. Now, I mentioned the importance of self-determination and self-determined learning. Before I talk about that, though, I want to talk a bit about how changes in the context of education itself are going to impact the education of all learners, including learners with diverse support needs. The Partnership for 21st Century Learning, or P21, was established to make recommendations for education in the 21st century. A report issued by that coalition framed the issues in this way. They said, quote, "Education was built for an economy and a society that no longer exists. In the manufacturing and agrarian economies that existed 50 years ago, it was enough to master the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. In the modern flat world, the 3 R's simply are not enough. If today's students want to compete in this global society, they must also be proficient communicators, creators, critical thinkers, and collaborators, or the 4 C's. In a recent book titled Deep Learning, Engaged the World, Changed the World, Michael Fullan, a thought leader in 21st century education, argued that we need to cultivate rich learning environments for children that are driven by learners' curiosity, that teach students to be problem designers, pose problems in which students can be actively involved, and structure schools where learning is about taking risks and lifelong venture. In these rich learning environments, adults believe children will exceed all expectations. Note that Fullan and colleagues say that these rich learning environments are driven by student curiosity, not just take advantage of student curiosity. Deep learning, Fullan explains, increases student engagement in learning through personalization and ownership. A world-class education, according to my colleague Yang Zhao, in his book World-Class Learners, Educating Creative and Entrepreneurial Students, is characterized by student voice in school governance and environment, student choice in a broad and flexible curriculum, and a strengths-based focus on student uniqueness and curiosity. Young notes that because of increased human productivity and the rapid rise of technology, people spend much less of their annual income on necessities like food, clothing, and shelter, and substantially more, in fact, more than twice what was the case in the 20th century, on everything else. While traditional jobs may be lost in a global technological economy, jobs will be gained in other, largely unidentified domains. As a result, more and more talents and abilities will have economic importance. He noted this, quote, "Today in the new age, a majority of traditional routine tasks that require a homogeneous set of skills and knowledge are now performed by machines, and human needs have shifted from basic needs to more psychological, aesthetic, and intellectual needs. Thus, the full spectrum of human talent has become economically valuable." Do you want an example of this that is relevant to our discussion today? In its December 2019 issue, Forbes profiled Anastasia Rodzinskaya. Anastasia is a 6-year-old girl who was born in southern Russia with cerebral palsy. According to the Forbes article in 2016, her parents began posting YouTube videos of Anastasia playing with her father and her toys, primarily to show friends and relatives her progress. Surprisingly, the views of these videos grew steadily as more people were attracted to Anastasia's personality. So the family signed a deal with a YouTube network to help grow their presence. Forbes profiled Anastasia because she is now the 3rd highest paid YouTuber in the world. She and her parents have 6 YouTube channels with combined subscriptions of more than 116 million people and 47 billion views. Her estimated total income in 2019 was $18 million annually. And let's go beyond the world of work in the 21st century. Every futurist I read makes 2 common points. First, automation and technology will create less demand for work as we've known it. And second, as a consequence, our non-life work will matter more than it does today. Futurists often challenge the notion of, quote, work-life balance as being a dated 20th century idea. In the 21st century, work and life will merge in ways that are simply not true today. So how might schools respond to changes in 21st century education, and how might they be structured? I want to talk a bit about a proposal by Young Zhao in a book he wrote titled Reach for Greatness, Personalizable Education for All Children. In Reach for Greatness, Young makes a series of arguments that help us, I think, understand how we need to structure education and transition in the 21st century. First, Young argues that the educational status quo is based upon 2 basic but flawed assumptions. One, there is a set of skills and knowledge everyone must have in order to live a successful life in the world. And 2, all children are capable of and interested in acquiring the skills and knowledge at a similar pace. If you think about it, that is exactly how our schools are structured today. Instead, as changes brought about by technology are making traditionally valued skills and knowledge obsolete, it introduces the need for schools to consider new human qualities, to embrace understandings of human nature and learning that emphasize that human beings are differently talented, have different desires and interests, and have different experiences that interact with their natural talent and interests to give each person a unique profile of abilities and desires, stronger in some areas than in others, and that in a world in which technology has and will continue to replace humans in routine tasks, we need human beings to be unique, creative, and entrepreneurial, and an education system that helps every student become uniquely creative and entrepreneurial. We as a field talk a lot about the importance of individualization. We talk about individualized education plans and programs and about individualizing instruction. And yet, far too often, the educational programs that students receive are based upon their disability label and low expectations associated with deficits models of disability. General education has not been much better. Young Zhao argues that, quote, the education system rarely cares about children's individual passions or talents and emphasizes primarily the, quote, talents of being a good student, following rules, doing homework, getting good grades, and passing tests. Young suggests that in the 21st century, we can shed the burden of determining who will succeed and who will not, and we can go for great for all children. First, we must embrace the idea that every student has their own unique profile of strengths and areas of needed supports, and that when everyone is unique, there is no utility whatsoever to the notion of average. Every student can be great in their own way. The road to greatness for all young people is through what Young Zhao calls personalizable education. There are 4 features of personalizable education: agency, shared ownership, flexibility, and value creation. Agency emphasizes what Fullen and Zhao both discuss for 21st century education, that, quote, for students to explore, identify, enhance their strengths, and follow their passions, they must become owners of their own learning. They must have agency in designing their own learning. We'll come back to this a bit when we talk about self-determination. Shared ownership emphasizes that students and adults, teachers, administrators, cafeteria workers, paraeducators, so on and so forth, are co-owners of what happens in the school. Third, schools must be flexible in all aspects of the school day and the school program: leadership, timetable, curriculum, facilities, students, and staffing. Flexibility is first and foremost a mindset that, quote, believes in the value of change and that plans, no matter how carefully thought out, will always have unexpected disruptions and or outcomes that require change. Finally, value creation means guiding students in turning their passions and strengths into something valuable, which makes learning meaningful and gives it purpose. If you're interested in learning more about personalizable education, I'd refer you to Young Zhao's Reaching for Greatness or A School of Our Own by Samuel Levin and Susan Engel, which describes a student-run high school that implements many of the elements emphasized by Fullen and Zhao. I wanted to briefly describe these innovations for 21st education to get us to think about how we structure transition in the 21st century to leverage the potential introduced by strengths-based approaches to disability and the opportunities introduced by 21st century education. Like 21st century education, the world of work is dramatically changing. It is estimated that young people entering the world of work today will occupy at least 10 and probably more careers. Not just jobs, careers over their lifetime. Leaders in the field of career and vocational guidance are having to completely reshape how they do business given changes in workforce needs driven by a global economy. Quote, the new job market, says Mark Civikas, whose scholarship has led the way in this field, quote, calls for viewing career not as a lifetime commitment to one employer, but as a recurrent selling of services and skills to a series of employers who need projects completed. Civikas pioneered the ideas of career construction and life design as frameworks for 21st century career vocational guidance and counseling, and I think that they can provide a similar framework for 21st century transition. The latter, career construction, reflects the idea that people will construct their own careers. Savickas identified the central thesis of career construction theory as recognizing that careers do not unfold. They're not just laid out in front of you. They are constructed, they are built as individuals make choices that express their own self-concepts and substantiate their goals in the social reality of work roles. A life design approach takes the career construction notion one step further. As work and non-work roles and identities merge, people will need to design not only their own work, but their own lives. The notion of work-life changes from meaning a distinct life at work to meaning that work and life share equal billing in one's life, not distinct identities. Career construction and life design models emphasize human flexibility and adaptability and lifelong learning, and enabling young people to become experts in constructing their own career paths, taking on transitions, addressing threats and opportunities, and designing a better life. What, in essence, the life design paradigm requires is that young people become self-determined and act autonomously to become causal agents in their own lives. Young people need to become agents to identify supports that close the gap between what they know and are able to do and what demands exist in work and life. So it is clear, I think, that to prepare young people for 21st century transitions, among the most important things we can do is to presume, first of all, that students are capable of succeeding, and to promote self-determination in student involvement in transition planning so that they are able to begin to construct and design their own learning and their own lives, to emphasize goal setting and problem solving, and to consider student strengths and support students to design a life based upon their strengths, interests, and abilities, to design a life and engage in learning that is meaningful to them because it takes advantage of their interests, their passions, their abilities. These are the same things, I think, emphasized in discussions about 21st century education in general, and that are illuminated by strength-based approaches to disability. And all of them rely on young people becoming self-determined learners and making things happen in their lives. So let me spend the time I have left with you talking about the importance of self-determination and self-determined learning in all of what I've discussed to this point. The source of the word determination in self-determination is the philosophical doctrine of determinism, which suggests that actions are caused by events or natural laws that precede or are antecedent to the occurrence of the action. Self-determinism, if you will, or self-determination implies then that individuals cause themselves to act in certain ways, as opposed to someone or something else causing them to act in certain other ways. People who are self-determined embody the characteristic or quality of self-determination, referring to the degree to which that person acts or behaves in ways that are self instead of other caused or determined. Within the context of the disability rights and advocacy movement, self-determination has been imbued with the empowerment and rights orientation reflective of a civil rights movement, referring to the rights of people with disabilities to self-governance. Empowerment, of course, is a term associated with social and civil rights movements, and typically is used in reference to actions that enhance the possibilities for people to control their lives. Finally, with regard to understanding the self-determination construct, although there is sufficient evidence that promoting self-determination is an important pedagogical practice, there is an embodiment of the changing understanding. It is as an embodiment of the changing understanding of disability that we discussed previously that is perhaps the most important. Jean-Paul Bovy, an American self-advocate, stated that many people believe, stated what many people with autism believe. People with autism, he said, should be treated with the same dignity, respect, and equality as people without autism. Robert Williams, who has been an influential leader in the disability movement in the United States, stated that, quote, "We," meaning people with disabilities, "don't have to be told what self-determination means. We know it is just another word for a life filled with rising expectations, dignity, respect, and opportunities." Dignity, respect, opportunity, value. When people with disabilities talk about self-determination, these are the terms they use. If we are serious about treating students with respect and dignity, we do so by empowering them to become more self-determined. If we are serious about changing how we think about disability, then we have to become serious about promoting self-determination. In our own work, we have proposed causal agency theory, which is intended to explain how people become self-determined, to frame the development and evaluation of interventions and assessments in self-determination. We define self-determination as acting as the causal agent in one's life. Self-determined people, that is causal agents, act in service to freely chosen goals. Self-determined actions function to enable people to be causal agents in their own lives. Causal agency implies that it is the person who makes or causes things to happen in his or her life. That the person acts with an eye to accomplish a specific end or to cause or create change. Self-determined actions enable a person to act as causal agent in their lives. There are a number of misperceptions of self-determination that impact the degree to which people with disabilities are supported to become more self-determined. Two such misperceptions are that being self-determined is interpreted strictly to mean doing it yourself or as having control. When this is the case, there is an obvious problem for people with disabilities, many of whom have limits to the number and types of activities they can perform independently, and often only have limited control over many aspects of their lives. As I've already mentioned, however, self-determination is not about controlling outcomes, but about causing things to happen in one's own life. The capacity to independently perform specific functions is secondary in importance in becoming self-determined to causing things to happen in one's own life. Self-determination is not just the independent performance of behaviors or about being in control. A person, for example, with a significant physical disability can employ a personal assistant to perform routine activities, and if such functions are performed under the control of that person, that is, the person with a disability, is really a moot point whether the person physically performed the activity. Likewise, a person with, say, a significant cognitive impairment may not be able to, quote, independently, that is, alone and with no support, make a complex decision or solve a difficult problem. To the extent, however, that supports are provided to enable that student to retain control over the decision-making process and to participate to the greatest extent possible in the decision-making or problem-solving process with whatever supports they need, that young person can become more self-determined. A colleague of mine provided an example of how making things happen in one's life and independent performance are decoupled. She tells the story of a young woman with quadriplegia who wanted to become a sculptor, even though she could not herself physically manipulate the clay. She had, through her own life experiences, learned how to communicate her vision for the artwork but her teachers and others expressed skepticism that this was a viable path for her. To convince them, this young woman set up two assistants, both of whom could communicate with her, but neither of whom could see the other. When she gave the instructions, the assistants produced identical pieces of complex sculpture. Through her personal experience with disability, this young woman had learned to articulate her vision and instructions in direct, specific ways, so much so that she got precisely the help she needed in forms that were replicable. Third, with regard to misperceptions of self-determination, it is important to note that being self-determined is not just being allowed to make choices. Acting volitionally implies action based upon one's preferences, which in turn suggests the importance of making choices. The problem, however, is that people have interpreted promoting self-determination to mean only, quote, allowing a person to make choices. And these choices are often prescribed and limited. Being self-determined means being engaged in all aspects of one's life, from addressing problems to being involved in decisions and in acting based upon one's preferences. Although I believe that the fact that people with disabilities tell us that self-determination is important to them is in and of itself a sufficient reason for us to focus on efforts in this area. The fact is that we have an abundance of evidence that students can become more self-determined if provided opportunities to learn and practice skills leading to self-determination. That there are strong positive relationships between enhanced self-determination and more positive self-reported quality of life and life satisfaction, and that students who are more self-determined achieve academic and transition goals at a higher rate, or more involved in the general education curriculum, achieve more positive independent living outcomes upon graduation, and achieve more positive employment outcomes upon graduation, and that promoting self-determination raises teachers' expectations of students' performance. In addition, we have good evidence pertaining to the importance of student involvement in educational and transition planning. We know that if provided such opportunities to learn and engage, students can participate in their planning more actively, that student involvement promotes self-determination, and that students who are more self-determined are more likely to be involved in their educational planning, and that student involvement results in enhanced transition knowledge, and students who are involved in their transition planning feel more empowered. We need to create learning environments within schools in which student autonomy is supported. When most people talk about autonomy, they're talking about the notion of autonomy as synonymous with independent performance. But self-determination is about making or causing things to happen in one's life, and is related to the notion of autonomy as volition, the degree to which young people regulate their behavior and their actions based upon their own values, preferences, and interests. Research in motivation has validated the importance of autonomy-supported classrooms and characterized and described the characteristics of autonomy-supported teaching practices, including communicating frequently to present expectations and to acknowledge students' feelings, offering more choices and removing controlling events in learning, allowing students to participate meaningfully and actively, providing positive and informational feedback, and providing structured guidance. We begin efforts to promote self-determination by ensuring that all students, including students with disabilities, receive high-quality instruction on what we call the component elements of self-determined action. Instruction that emphasizes student choice making and involvement in instructional decisions, teaching goal setting and attainment, planning and problem solving skills, teaching students self-regulation and self-management skills, as well as self-advocacy skills, self-knowledge, and self-awareness. Keep in mind, though, what I've mentioned about self-determination. It's about making or causing things to happen in your life. The goal is not necessarily that students do all of these things, decision-making, problem-solving, goal-setting, independently, but that they are supported to engage in and learn these component elements with whatever levels of support that they need. Our primary research and intervention focus has been on how we enable young people to become self-determined learners. How do we enable teachers to teach students to teach themselves? In self-determined learning, students learn how to set and achieve goals and make plans. Teachers relinquish ownership for learning to the student by creating learning communities and using teaching methods that emphasize students' curiosity and experiences. Creating learning communities that are autonomy supportive and ensuring that learning is tied to activities that are intrinsically motivating or lead to the attainment of goals that are valued and based upon student preferences, interests, values, and preferences. In self-determined learning, teachers emphasize mastery experiences using assessment, both teacher-directed and student-directed, to provide supportive feedback and aligning instruction with student strengths and abilities, and provide choice opportunities, supporting volition and emphasizing the goal process and not just goal outcomes. Students take initiative learning because learning is meaningful and of personal value to them, and they act volitionally because they are provided choices that are meaningful, meaningfully different, and autonomy supportive. To provide teachers with an instructional model that would enable them to teach students to, in essence, teach themselves, we have developed and evaluated the self-determined learning model of instruction. The SDLMI is a teaching model designed to support teachers to teach students to self-regulate goal setting and attainment, to enable them to engage in causal action. Students are supported to learn to self-regulate problem solving, to set relevant goals, create an action plan, or achieve an action plan or goal as necessary. We have very strong evidence that students with disabilities can successfully learn these skills, and if they do so, achieve more positive school and transition outcomes. And further, we are evaluating the efficacy of this with students without disabilities, because these are issues that are relevant to all learners, not just students with disabilities. We have also validated a new measure of self-determination, the self-determination inventory system, which consists of self and adult report measures of volitional action, causal action, and action control beliefs, our framework for causal agency theory. We have evidence of the causal relationship between instruction using the model and more improved school and post-school outcomes for students with disabilities, including evidence that shows that if students are taught using the model, they become more self-determined and achieve more positive school outcomes, including academic goal attainment and transition goal attainment, and more positive post-school outcomes, including higher rates of community inclusion and more positive employment outcome. It is, of course, not only students with disabilities who need to learn how to self-regulate goal setting and attainment and to be causal agents in their own lives. This is important for all young people, as I mentioned, with or without disabilities. And we are engaged in multiple activities examining the impact and implementing the SDLMI for all students with and without disabilities in high school as a Tier 1 intervention in multi-tiered systems of support. Let me close my remarks by sharing a story told by my colleague and friend Ray Gagne. Ray was a man with cerebral palsy who lived part of his life in an institution for people with developmental disabilities. Ray later became a leader in the self-advocacy movement, and he and I became friends when he served on the board of directors at the ARC of the United States and chaired that national organization's self-advocacy committee. In 1996, I co-edited a book titled Self-Determination Across the Lifespan, Independence and Choice for People with Disabilities. And as the editing process wound down and the publication date neared, I invited Ray to write the foreword for this book. Ray was uncertain about his capacity to write a foreword. He said he'd never done that before. And he was, I think, somewhat anxious about the process. I assured him that he knew as much as anyone about self-determination and asked him simply to write something about why self-determination was important to him. I vividly remember the facts that Ray sent to me with his foreword, one that I sent on to the publisher unedited, because in a simple story, Ray had captured both the essence of self-determination and the importance of it to his life. In that foreword, Ray wrote, "When I moved to New Bedford in Massachusetts, I wanted to open a checking account. I went over to the bank and gave the $10 to open the account and asked them if there would be a problem. They said no. But when I went back a couple of days later, they said they couldn't understand my signature." I thought about this, Ray continued, and I realized that I had had a checking account before I moved and that had worked just fine. The next morning, I put on a suit and a tie and went down to the main branch. I asked to see the bank president. They told me he was in a meeting. I told them I would wait. I waited for about 2 minutes and he came out. He brought me into a room and asked me what the problem was. I told him. I also brought my canceled checks and showed him that I had had an account before. He apologized and I got my checking account. Ray knew that to live independently in the community, he needed a checking account. What did he do? First, he recognized that the problem was with the bank and not with him. He knew about himself and believed that he could successfully manage a checking account. He had a plan of action to address his problem, and he implemented it. He put on a coat and a tie and went to the main office of the bank and requested to see someone who could make a difference, the bank president. He was assertive and didn't give up when he was told that he couldn't see the president. When he was successful in gaining an audience with the president, he was prepared to state his problem and to provide evidence in support of his case. In the end, he got both an apology and the checking account he needed to be able to live independently in the community. That, said Ray, is why self-determination was important to him. And fundamentally, that is why self-determination is important to all learners with and without disabilities in the 21st century. By promoting self-determination and self-determined learning, we enable young people to, in fact, build their own life, their own work, their own work-life experience. For more information about our work in self-determination, I would invite you to visit our website at www.self-determination.org. You can access information about the self-determined learning model of instruction, as well as gain access to the self-determination inventory.